I'm James Turk. I'm a director of the GoldMoney Foundation. I'm here at the Go Ahead Business Summit in Vienna, Austria. And it's my pleasure to be here today with Gregor Hochreiter and the author of Krankes, Kranke, Welt, which basically means in English, sick money, sick world. Gregor, it's a pleasure to be with you here today. Can you pronounce your book in German to correct my bad pronunciation?
First of all, thank you very much for having invited me to this interview. The title in German is Krankes, Kranke, Welt. I wrote it in 2010, and it's more or less an introduction into the Austrian monetary and business cycle theory with a little an appendix stating that also we have a sick money because the world is sick in a moral sense.
Okay. What do you mean sick in a moral sense? You know, is it the old Lenin dictum that bad money is the way you destroy a society?
Yeah, that's one way if you want that there are certain actors in society who deliberately want to destroy society, but I also think it's an overemphasis of the entire society on monetary issues. Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist, he wrote that if you don't have an inner meaning in your life, that basically you try to compensate that by striving for more and more money. And more money means, of course, money in a nominal sense. So you're striving for quantity instead of for quality. And I think this is something we can see in many aspects of our society, not only monetary issues.
What about in terms of the broader sense, in terms of the Austrian economics, is that a basic tenet of the Austrian school of thinking?
Yeah, the Austrian school actually stresses very much that institutions have an influence on everyday behavior. So they would more or less argue that because our monetary system is sick in a sense that it's highly inflationary, that it provides an excessive credits, that this leads, for example, to a short-sightedness in all areas of society. So that means the households are consuming way too much, politicians are striving just for success at the next elections, and that businesses also, they grow way too quickly. Instead of using their own equity, they are taking credit in order to finance their expansion. But the Austrians put the emphasis on the institution, so saying that it's because central banks are inflating way too much, this is an effect on our everyday behavior.
Yeah, I see what you mean by having a sickness on the whole world in terms of things getting out of whack from the ways people would normally think and react in society when interacting with one another, which of course is a basic tenet of Austrian economics, that people strive in life to improve their situation. And they do that by voluntary cooperation in the marketplace, so that when, or what Adam Smith called the invisible hand, when you're providing goods and services and someone else is purchasing those goods and services, both of you are improving your situation, which is, I guess, the essential nature of the capitalist society in which we live. But what is it that makes sick money?
Yeah,
inflation is a sign. Yeah. That's not really the cause, right?
First of all, yeah, there's an issue on the definitions. I'm very strict on that, and I use inflation in German only as indicating an increase in the money supply, or an increase in the unpacked money supply. So that because of inflation, we have an increase in the price level. So basically, that's the terminology I'm using. So in that sense, the main problem nowadays is inflation, meaning that the central banks, or the banking system as a whole, consisting of the central bank and the commercial banks, that they inflate the money supply. And for example, this leads to the effect that hardworking and saving people or companies are driven out systematically by those who finance their expansion on credit, because of course they can always pay higher prices than those who just draw on their savings.
Okay, understood. How do you go about getting rid of sick money and going to sound money?
Yeah, I think that was one of the very tough things. How to end a book? You know, it's easy to start writing a book, but what is the final accord on which you want to end? And I realized that, if I had the power for one day and could push the red button and have at least a healthy monetary system which would be non-inflationary, but if people don't change, you would have the same mess 2 days afterwards again. So I think in the long run, we also need to have a change in our personal attitude towards life, which brings me again back to these moral issues. Because why aren't there any politicians who get elected for at least realizing a balanced budget? It's also because there's no electorate demanding it, or a very small electorate. So I think in the long run, we need to take into consideration that our institutions reflect what people think, what people want. But technically speaking, it wouldn't be so difficult. It's first of all to prevent commercial banks from fractional reserve banking, which means that any demand deposit has to be backed by 100% by banknotes. And when we come to monetary production, also the central banks, if there are any, they should not be allowed to inflate, to print more money than they have gold or silver in their vaults.
Okay, understood. Do you see central banks then as part of the solution or part of the problem? The reason why I asked this is you may have seen a monograph I wrote a number of years ago where I described central banking as the barbarous relic because of their interventions in the marketplace and things of that nature. Yeah, that's
basically they're part of the problem. But one has to say also that they were introduced in Europe, but also in the United States, also to stabilize, so to say, the banking system, and the banking system which is run on wrong, let's say, premises. So in a sense, I'm against central banks, but I would argue that only if commercial banks are run on proper, especially legal, on a legal foundation, then there's no real need for a central bank, at least not in the modern sense. So in the end, they are part of the problem. They are the final stone in this entire financial architecture, which could not survive without a central bank.
Do you look at fractional reserve banking in your book?
Yeah.
Is that what you mean by problems within the banking system?
Yeah.
The inherent nature of the insolvency of fractional reserve banking?
Yeah, basically I'm using an approach which Jesus Huerta de Soto is also propounding in his Money Banking in the Business Cycle. And I have a very good friend of mine who works just next door. He's a professor for Roman law. So basically I'm debating with him all these issues all the time. And I think this is the main, so the economic problem is the second step. The first one is to have a clear concept of legal titles. And then we can continue the economic analysis, or let's say the reform of the economic constitution.
Yeah,
institutions, sorry.
Have you looked at titles in private property in Roman law as opposed to Anglo-Saxon common law? And do you have a view on one or the other?
Actually, I've just looked on the Roman law approach to it. And there you have the institution of which would be a forerunner to the fractional reserve banking, that's called the depositum irregolare. So we have a 200,000-year tradition on that specific legal title. But again, one has also to ask the question, why are banks so eager to give so many credits? And I think this is also a common feature nowadays, that economic behavior becomes more or less the most important part of life. Let's say, so instead of you having a internal or inner regulation on economic behavior, saying this is a means to an end. Okay, we earn money just to spend it, to have a nice evening with the family, to go on holidays or whatever. It takes more and more attention all the time. And I think there's also a problem on that part here.
But if it's taking more attention, that's probably an indication that the money is sick, right? What I like to use as an example is that, as I understand it, during the height of the German hyperinflation in the Weimar Republic, that in Berlin, 22% of the effort, workforce and whatnot, was trying to counteract the effects of the hyperinflation. You know, they are either printing money, counting money, moving money around, spending money in order to offset the sick money that was circulating as currency. Whereas, you know, to have almost 1/4 of the population dealing with the sick money just doesn't make economic sense. It should probably be something less than 1% of the effort is involved with the monetary side. Is that the point that you're basically getting at?
Yeah, I just want to draw the attention that both, one has to look on both sides. So institutions influence our everyday behavior, but also the other way around. And I think that a too one-sided approach very quickly lacks in the end a very fundamental insight. So also how you can implement a reform. Again, on the technical side, it's very easy. Of course, you can debate all day long as an academic whether you should have a 100% backing of demand deposits or whether you have the free banking solution. But in the end, also the population has to accept any reform. And even though there are many people who earn a lot of money with the current financial systems and there are these crooks, if the population would not accept the current monetary system and also the current way how politics is done just by financing a debt through inflating the money supply, then of course a change would be here immediately. And not because of a crackdown of the system, but people realize that this system is wrong on very different levels.
Okay. Now, you're from Vienna and
Yeah.
you went to school here. Did you learn about Austrian economics here at school?
Not even at university level. It was just then I did a master in Denmark and had a lot of time to read, and so I grabbed a book of Mises and started reading. But here at the university...
You studied economics here in Vienna?
I studied economics here in Vienna.
Oh, that's interesting. I thought it was only in the United States where they didn't teach Austrian economics. No. Here in the heart of the Mises and Menger and everybody else, they don't teach it in the university. Is that changing now, or...?
Not to my knowledge. The problem is that especially the faculty of the Department of Economics is more and more turning a Department of Mathematics. And actually we see that most debates are very narrow, both at the university, also in the public level, even though there are here and there now some Austrian economists who are heard. But at university level, I think it's very meager.
What about within government? I mean, the logic of Austrian economics is so compelling. It makes so much good common sense. Is there a greater acceptance now in government? In the United States, for example, the advocate there has been, as I'm sure you're aware, Ron Paul. Is there someone like that here in Austria?
No. And one must not forget that monetary debates here are at the European level, or at least at the Eurogroup level, so we don't have an autonomous monetary policy anymore. So this hinders also debates at that level. So basically I think it's among lay persons you see an actually dramatic increase in interest in Austrian economics, but also in various other non-orthodox economic thinkers, which I think, first of all, is a positive sign. So people try to break up certain narrow limits on thinking. But if there was a debate, then in Germany you have it now a little bit with Frank Schäffler of the FDP, who is drawing on Austrian economics.
So
but again,
you're saying that Austrians are happy with the way things are working in the Eurozone?
No, definitely not. But even though this would not be now the general statement of an Austrian economist, but I think in the end it's also a political problem. If, for example, Germany decided, and I'm now using Germany as an example because they are a huge country, Austria as a small country has not so much influence. If they would decide to break out of the Eurozone, then they could do it and re-establish a D-Mark, maybe based or hopefully based on insights of the Austrian School of Economics. But again, in the Eurozone, then you have the problem, people with different languages. I mean, there cannot be a public debate. First of all, also because of language barriers. So this, in the end, in the Eurozone would mean that you try to have an autonomous monetary policy, again, which means the breakup of the euro.
Yeah. Do you address the issue of the euro in your book?
No, because I'm basically debating it from a very general theoretical level, but written for a layperson, so that everybody gets a first idea what is wrong. And I don't want to, I'm actually not presenting now blueprints for reform. I'm more or less, I'm hoping that in various parts of Europe or in Austria, the people sit together, start to think and try to find their own ways, which hopefully are based on these ideas, but if they find better solution, the better.
What about gold? How do you see gold in the monetary system?
I'm writing with a friend of mine on a book on the gold standard in very broad sense, and I read a lot of books now of the 19th century. I was very surprised that in the 19th century, during the gold standard, the money supply increased dramatically. Mostly through the commercial banking system, but not only, because there was hardly any 100% backing. I think that the debate is important, but I'm looking at it again from a more general level. I think that we need to find, many people not only feel but also understand that our current economic setup or institutions are fundamentally wrong in the sense that they create this permanent ups and downs. And if we find a solution using gold, that's fine. I'm more for silver because purchasing power is lower, so you can also use it for everyday life. And I think that people should use coins again, having the money really in their hands and not just a money certificate. But gold could definitely play a role in a new institutional arrangement, especially for international trade, where this purchasing power argument does not hold if you have wholesale trades and of this.
Yeah, Huerta de Soto's book, Money, Banking, and Economic Cycles, does a very good job of analyzing, the 19th century and particularly Peel's Bank Act in the UK and the implications, of that. Just, turning back to solutions again. Do you see politicians coming up with solutions to today's monetary imbalances? Or are we going to go from crisis to crisis to crisis until eventually, the whole house of cards comes tumbling down?
First of all, on the positive side, there are people now like Frank Schäffler, a member of the German Bundestag and in various other parliaments, who I would say they have a sound monetary ideas of sound money, which they hopefully could implement. But again, I think it also would need time. So in the short run, I'm very pessimistic. In the long run, I'm quite optimistic because among young people, again, you see a break-up, renewed interest in ideas. But in the short run, again, and now I'm defending some politicians, what can you do? That's really also the problem. I mean, if you find out as a minister that, okay, things go absolutely wrong, how can you communicate this to the population and also within the European Union? I mean, it would immediately mean that you had to leave the Eurozone, which I think is not a negative way, but again, then you have to come up with, again, a political solution, how European countries would then coordinate their political existence. So I think from a long-term perspective, the short-term problems are not as important. I would not put too much emphasis on short-term political solutions.
Isn't money only a problem when it's been politicized by the politicians and the government? So, for example, back in the 19th century, under the classical gold standard, the discipline was imposed by the amount of gold that was available to turn into currency. Thereby, you remove the political fiddling, assuming the politicians followed the rules, which they didn't in the 20th century. But isn't that the key, to get money away from the political process? And isn't that part of the thinking in the Austrian school?
Yeah, the Austrians would definitely agree to that, and I think that this would be a major step. But one must also not forget, in the 19th century, under the classical gold standard, there were many commercial banks which did fractional reserve banking, and it was quite interesting. There was a short note in the records of the Austrian National Bank in the 1860s, and they said, yeah, the commercial banks are demanding so much money, we have no time printing it. And the reason was because of fractional reserve banking, the commercial banks suffered from a bank run. So I would say that every part of the society has to make certain changes. So the society as a whole has to redefine its approach to money or to material wealth as such, because only then reform will last for a long time. Again, after the next elections, you could again have politicians in the parliament who would change the reform of 2 years ago. So I think that in a society which acknowledges legal rights, which does not permanently strive for more and more in an unrestricted sense, there you will also have a healthy money. And I think it's the task of the politicians to institute or to help institutionalizing this reform. I don't think that the current political elite is willing to do this. But in 10, 15 years, things could be differently.
Yeah, hopefully 10 or 15 months, not 10 or 15 years.
Yeah.
I think you're probably more right than what I would be hoping for. I agree with you. Rule of law, respect for private property, that's the building block of any free society. And then I would take it to the next level where I think money outside of the political control is also a building block for a free society. And there's been a lot of literature on the historical link between human liberty and gold, and I think that's probably also within the thinking of the Austrian school, at least my reading of it.
Yeah, definitely. I think the one argument one must bear in mind is again that the purchasing power is so high that if you have a gold or solely a gold standard without supplementing it by silver or by copper coins, then you necessarily have a more or less the same system as nowadays. The only difference is that you can that your banknote can be changed into physical gold, which I think would be a very important improvement. But then also I would favor that you can exchange it in very small denominations, because if you, for example, can just 1 kilogram of gold, then hardly anybody has enough purchasing power to change their banknotes into physical gold.
Yeah, that's why in gold money, you can go down to a mil, a thousandth of a gram, and I do see gold as an important building block of a free society. Just a couple last questions. Will the euro survive?
That's in the end a political decision.
Isn't it more what the people put up with?
Yeah, that's not. Yeah, for me that's not a strict antagonism, but it's obvious that the euro should also from the political elite side should survive because of political reasons. I don't think so that the euro will survive, but the elite will try to keep it at every cost.
But the Austrian school would say the more government interference you have in the free market process, the less goods and services are going to be produced because you have less interaction in society. Whenever you impose impediments and the market is not allowed, or people are not allowed to operate freely, or they have too many impediments and burden imposed on them, that ultimately hurts economic growth and economic activity.
That's absolutely true, but there's a dogma which is used all the time now, that without the euro, that the European Union is dead, and then of course as a consequence of it, many of the elite believe that then there will be war again in Europe. And I think under this is the mindset of the people. And I would argue, if you're in favor of a free and peaceful Europe, then you have nowadays to be again against the euro, because as Martin Feldstein, I think it was, already wrote in the 1990s, that the euro in the end will lead to war. So actually arguing the other way around. But this is
lead to increasing nationalism,
yeah, exactly,
which will then ultimately lead to war. Yeah.
It's also a political decision again, because then the European project, as it has evolved in the last, let's say, 30 years, is dead. And this is something which many people don't want. And I think we lack ideas what could be the Europe after the European Union.
Yeah, interesting. Well, I'm sure people don't want war, but I don't think they want bureaucrats in Brussels telling them how to live their lives, or a central bank buying government paper and debasing the currency. So, I mean, there are obviously some tough decisions that are going to have to be made in the future.
Yeah.
Well, it's been a real pleasure speaking with you, Gregor. I've been speaking with Gregor Hochreiter, Krankes, Krankes, Kranke, Welt.
Excellent.
Improving my pronunciation a little bit. And look forward to seeing this translated someday into English. Gregor, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I'm James Turk. I'm a director of the GoldMoney Foundation. I'm here at the Go Ahead Business Summit in Vienna, Austria. And it's my pleasure to be here today with Gregor Hochreiter and the author of Krankes, Kranke, Welt, which basically means in English, sick money, sick world. Gregor, it's a pleasure to be with you here today. Can you pronounce your book in German to correct my bad pronunciation?
First of all, thank you very much for having invited me to this interview. The title in German is Krankes, Kranke, Welt. I wrote it in 2010, and it's more or less an introduction into the Austrian monetary and business cycle theory with a little an appendix stating that also we have a sick money because the world is sick in a moral sense.
Okay. What do you mean sick in a moral sense? You know, is it the old Lenin dictum that bad money is the way you destroy a society?
Yeah, that's one way if you want that there are certain actors in society who deliberately want to destroy society, but I also think it's an overemphasis of the entire society on monetary issues. Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist, he wrote that if you don't have an inner meaning in your life, that basically you try to compensate that by striving for more and more money. And more money means, of course, money in a nominal sense. So you're striving for quantity instead of for quality. And I think this is something we can see in many aspects of our society. They're taking credit in order to finance their expansion. But the Austrians put the emphasis on the institution. So saying that it's because central banks are inflating way too much, this is an effect on our everyday behavior.
Yeah, I see what you mean by having a sickness on the whole world in terms of things getting out of whack from the ways people would normally think and react in society when interacting with one another, which of course is a basic tenet of Austrian economics, that people strive in life to improve their situation, and they do that by voluntary cooperation in the marketplace, so that when, or what Adam Smith called the invisible hand, when you're providing goods and services and someone else is purchasing those goods and services, both of you are improving your situation, which is, I guess, the essential nature of the capitalist society in which we live. But what is it that makes...
Not only monetary issues.
What about in terms of the broader sense, in terms of the Austrian economics? Is that a basic tenet of the Austrian school of thinking?
Yeah, the Austrian school actually stresses very much that institutions have an influence on everyday behavior. So they would more or less argue that because our monetary system is sick in a sense that it's highly inflationary, that it provides an excessive credits, that this leads, for example, to a short-sightedness in all areas of society. So that means the households are consuming way too much, politicians are striving just for success at the next elections, and that businesses also, they grow way too quickly. Instead of using their own equity, they are taking credit.
Makes sick money.
Yeah,
inflation is a sign. That's not really the cause, right?
First of all, yeah, there's an issue on the definitions. I'm very strict on that, and I use inflation in German only as indicating an increase in the money supply, or an increase in the unpacked money supply. So that because of inflation, we have an increase in the price level. So basically that's the terminology I'm using. So in that sense, the main problem nowadays is inflation, meaning that the central banks or the banking system as a whole, consisting of the central bank and the commercial banks, that they inflate the money supply. And for example, this leads to the effect that hardworking and saving people or companies are driven out systematically by those who finance their expansion on credit, because of course they can